Sable had not spoken a word in 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. She knew the exact count, because silence was not a thing that faded into habit. It was a choice she made every single morning when she opened her eyes, and every single night when she closed them. A vow carved into the walls of her chest like a scar that refused to heal. So when her voice came back, raw and fractured and impossible, in the middle of the Alpha King's private war chamber at 2 a.m, she was not the only one who stopped breathing. King Caspian Valoris froze mid-stride. His hand, which had been reaching for the hilt of the blade mounted on the wall, hung suspended in the air. His entire body locked rigid, every muscle seized as though the sound of her voice had driven a spike through his spine. The word she had spoken was his name, not his title. Not Your Majesty. Not the formal address that every soul in the Ashenmoor Kingdom was expected to use when referring to the sovereign who had ended the Black Fang Rebellion with nothing but 400 soldiers and a fury that had passed into legend. Just his name, low and broken and desperate, Caspian. The silence that followed was so absolute, she could hear the candle wax dripping onto the iron holder beside the door, the wind pressing against the frost-covered window. Her own heartbeat, slamming so hard it made her ribs ache. He turned slowly. His dark gold eyes found hers across the room, and what she saw in them made her knees buckle. Not anger, not shock. Recognition. Like he had been waiting to hear that voice, and now that it had come, something inside him was shattering. But we need to go back. Back to the beginning of this, before the silence broke. Before the war chamber, before everything fell apart. Because to understand why a mute Omega speaking the Alpha King's name in the dead of night could bring a man like Caspian Valoris to his knees, you need to understand how thoroughly he had ignored her, how completely she had been invisible to him, and how the thing that finally made her speak was not love, or courage, or even choice. It was the fact that he was about to die, and she was the only one in the castle who knew it. 3 years earlier, Sable had arrived at the Ashenmoor Keep as part of a tribute. That was the polite word the border packs used when they sent their weakest members to the capital as proof of loyalty. The impolite word was offering. 12 Omegas from the Grey Mist settlement, delivered to the king's household like seasonal grain, expected to serve in whatever capacity the crown required. Sable had been the smallest of the 12. 17 years old, underweight, with a bruise fading on her jaw from where the Grey Mist Pack Alpha had struck her for not moving fast enough during the packing. It was not the blow that had silenced her. It was what happened during the presentation. The 12 Omegas had been lined up in the Great Hall, shoulder to shoulder, while the king walked the line. Caspian Valoris was 23 years old at the time, newly crowned, still wearing the aftermath of the rebellion in the hard set of his mouth and the shadows carved beneath his eyes. He was enormous, not just tall, though he was that, but wide through the shoulders and chest in a way that made the Great Hall feel smaller simply because he was standing in it. He had walked the line slowly, pausing before each Omega to acknowledge their presence with a brief nod. A formality, a ritual, nothing personal. When he reached Sable, he paused. His gaze dropped to her face, traveled over the bruise on her jaw, and something flickered in his expression. Something sharp and brief that she could not read. Then he moved on. Without the nod. He simply walked past her as though she were not there, continued down the line, finished the inspection, and left the hall without a single glance back. The other Omegas had received acknowledgement. A nod, however brief, however impersonal, was recognition of existence. She had received nothing. She had been looked at, assessed, and dismissed in a single breath. The humiliation was a living thing inside her chest. It coiled around her lungs and squeezed until she could not draw air. She stood in that line long after the others had been led away, staring at the door through which the king had disappeared. And she decided, in that frozen, airless moment, that if the king of Ashenmoor did not think she was worth a single nod, then she would not give him a single word. Not one. Not ever. Her silence became her armor. She was assigned to the lower kitchens initially, then moved to the apothecary stores when Mistress Orena, the castle's head healer, noticed that Sable had an unusual talent for identifying herbs by smell alone. She communicated through gestures, through written notes on scraps of parchment, through the careful language of hands and eyes that the other servants learned to read over time. Some thought she was cursed. Others thought she was simple. A few, the kind ones, understood that her silence was deliberate and respected it without asking why. Mistress Orena was among the latter. She never once asked Sable to speak. She simply handed her tasks, accepted the written notes, and treated her like any other apprentice. 3 years passed. Sable grew from a starved, bruised girl into a quiet, watchful woman of 20. She knew every herb in the apothecary by heart, could mix a fever draft in the dark, and had developed a reputation among the household staff as the person you went to when you needed something fixed without any questions asked. She had not spoken a single word in all that time. Not when she burned her hand on a crucible. Not when a guardsman cornered her in a stairwell, and she had to break his wrist to get free. Not when the night terrors came and she woke gasping, biting into her pillow to trap the screams. And she had not seen the king up close since the day of the presentation. He existed at a distance, a figure crossing the courtyard, a voice echoing from behind closed council doors, a presence that filled the castle without ever intersecting with her invisible life. Until the night everything changed. It began, as most disasters do, with someone else's emergency. Mistress Orena had been summoned to the eastern garrison where a fever had swept through the barracks. That left Sable alone in the apothecary when Torben, the king's beta, appeared in the doorway at 9:30 in the evening. Torben was a lean, sharp-featured man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of calm that only came from spending years managing catastrophes on behalf of someone more powerful. He looked at Sable, then at the empty workroom behind her, and his jaw tightened. "Where is Mistress Orena?" he asked. Sable pointed east and held up her hand, fingers spread. 5 days. Torben closed his eyes briefly, the gesture of a man whose contingency plan had just evaporated. "I need a healer. Now. The king's evening draft, his sleeping aid. Tonight it smells wrong. I need someone who can tell me whether it has been poisoned." Sable's chest went cold. She hesitated for exactly 1 second, then reached for her kit. She had spent years building a life in the margins, years learning to exist without being noticed, without being acknowledged, without mattering to anyone whose opinion carried weight. And now, a beta she barely knew was asking her to walk into the most heavily guarded part of the castle and examine a substance that might be a death sentence for the most powerful man in the kingdom. Every rational instinct told her to refuse, to point Torben toward one of the other healers in the lower wards, someone with credentials and authority and a voice to explain their findings. But the other healers did not know herbs the way she did. Orena had said so herself, more than once. The walk to the king's private quarters was the longest of her life. Every corridor seemed to stretch. Every staircase felt steeper than it had any right to be. The upper levels were a different world. The stone cleaner, the tapestries richer, the air warmer. The guards stationed at every junction watched her pass with flat, assessing eyes, and she felt each gaze like a hand pressing against her sternum. Torben stopped before a heavy iron-banded door and knocked twice. There was no response from within. "He is in his war chamber," Torben said quietly. "Not his bedchamber. He will not be disturbed. You will examine the draft in the antechamber and report to me. You will not enter the war chamber. You will not approach the king. Is that understood?" Sable nodded. The antechamber was small and functional, a desk, 2 chairs, a fireplace, and a side table where a single glass vial sat on a silver tray. The sleeping draft. She set down her kit and got to work. She uncorked the vial and held it beneath her nose. Valerian and passion flower, standard sedative herbs. Beneath that, something bitter. She dipped a glass rod into the liquid and touched it to her tongue. Metallic. Sharp. Wrong. Her stomach dropped. She pulled a strip of litmus parchment from her kit and applied a single drop. The paper darkened to a deep violet. Night bloom extract. Odorless in small doses, tasteless when masked by strong herbs, and lethal within 72 hours. It did not kill immediately. It accumulated in the blood, attacking the organs slowly so that by the time the symptoms appeared, it was far too late. She tested 3 more times, using different reagents, praying she was wrong. She was not wrong. The note she scrawled for Torben was barely legible, her handwriting jagged with urgency. Torben read it, and the color drained from his face. "You need to examine him," Torben said, his voice tight. "Tonight." Sable shook her head violently. She pointed at the closed door to the king's study, then crossed her arms in an X. "I know what I said, but if there is night bloom in his blood, every hour matters. Orenna is 5 days away. You are the only healer in this castle." She thought of the great hall, the line of omegas, the king's gaze passing over her like she was air. Then she thought of him dying in his sleep because she was too proud to walk through a door. She picked up her kit. The king's study was enormous. Maps covered every surface, pinned to walls, spread across the central table, layered 3 deep in some places. Candles burned low in iron holders, casting long shadows that made the room feel like it was breathing. And there, at the far end of the table, both hands braced against the edge, head bowed over a territorial map, was the king. He did not acknowledge the door opening, did not react to the sound of footsteps crossing the stone floor. "Later," Caspian said without raising his head. His voice was deep and rough, the voice of a man who had been awake too long and knew it and did not care. "Sire, it cannot wait," Torben pressed. The king's head came up, his eyes swept past Torben to Sable, and she watched them narrow. Not with recognition. He saw a servant, a tool brought to perform a task, nothing more. "Fine, be quick." She needed his wrist, pulse rate, skin temperature, vein color. She crossed to the table and reached for his hand. The moment her fingers touched his skin, 2 things happened simultaneously. A jolt of sensation shot up her arm, sharp and electric and blinding. Every nerve in her body fired at once, and her wolf, dormant for years, silent so long she had almost forgotten it existed, surged forward with such force that her vision blurred, and her knees nearly buckled. And the king went perfectly still. His eyes dropped to where her fingers rested against his wrist. His pupils dilated. His breathing hitched, a single sharp inhale that he held and did not release. The muscle in his jaw clenched so hard she could see the tendon strain beneath the skin. For one impossible second, neither of them moved. The room contracted around them, the maps and candles and Torben's presence all falling away until there was nothing but the point of contact between her fingertips and his pulse. Then he pulled his hand away, like her touch had burned him. "That will be all," he said, his voice like iron. Sable gathered her kit and left without looking back. But her hands did not stop shaking for hours, and her wolf, silent for 3 years, would not stop howling. Sable did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow cot staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment her fingers had touched the king's wrist. The jolt, the heat. The way the creature inside her had lunged forward like something suddenly unchained after years of captivity. She knew what it meant. Every shifter knew. The pull, the recognition, the bone-deep certainty that someone was yours and you were theirs, and the universe had decided this long before either of you had drawn your first breath. But those bonds were for real wolves. Wolves with packs and bloodlines and standing. Not for silent, nameless omegas handed over as tribute and forgotten in a basement apothecary. More importantly, the king was being poisoned, and she was the only one who knew it. She shoved the recognition aside, buried it beneath the practical work of survival, and forced herself to think like a healer instead of a wolf. By morning, she had a plan. She could not examine Caspian directly, not without orders, not without Orenna's authority. But she could trace the poison's supply chain. She spent the entire day cataloging every bottle, every jar, every sealed container in Arena's inventory, cross-referencing against the purchase records and the dispensary logs. It was tedious, painstaking work, the kind that made her eyes ache and her fingers cramp, but she was thorough. She was always thorough. The night bloom was not coming from the apothecary. Someone else was supplying the king's sleeping draught. Someone with access to his private quarters and the knowledge to mask the poison beneath layers of legitimate sedative herbs. Someone who understood dosage well enough to keep the accumulation just below the threshold of obvious symptoms. This was not carelessness. This was craft. She wrote everything down. The test results, the concentration estimates, the timeline of accumulation she had calculated from the single sample. The fact that someone in the king's inner household was deliberately and systematically poisoning him. She sealed the letter with wax and went to find Torben. He was gone. The day after bringing Sable to the king, he had ridden out to the eastern garrison to meet Mistress Arena personally about the barracks fever. He would return in 2 days. 2 days the king might not have. She stood in the corridor, the sealed letter in her hand, and felt panic claw at the inside of her throat. She could leave the letter with a guard. She could find another member of the household staff, someone with enough authority to act. But any member of the household could be the poisoner. Any guard could be compromised. Trust was a luxury she could not afford. There was only one person she could be certain was not poisoning the king. Past midnight. The corridors were empty, the torches burning low. The guards at the junctions recognized her from the previous night and let her pass without challenge. She reached the iron-banded door and tried the handle. Unlocked. The antechamber was dark, the fire burned to embers, the inner door slightly ajar. The king was on the floor. Not collapsed. Seated against the wall beneath the mounted weapons, knees drawn up, head tipped back against the stone. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow, each inhale catching slightly like something was obstructing it from the inside. In the dim light of the dying embers, the shadows beneath his eyes looked like bruises, and his skin had a grayish undertone that she recognized from the fever wards. The look of a body fighting a war it did not know it was losing, and his hands. The veins at his wrists had darkened, threading beneath his skin like black ink seeping through wet paper. The night bloom was already in his blood. Weeks of accumulation, maybe longer, masked by the exhaustion everyone attributed to the weight of the crown. The insomnia they blamed on the rebellion's aftermath. The pallor they assumed came from too many hours in a room without windows. She dropped to her knees beside him, 2 fingers to the inside of his wrist, thready pulse, too fast, irregular. His eyes opened, glazed, unfocused. Then recognition of intrusion arrived, and his hand shot out, grip crushing around her wrist. "Who sent you?" he rasped. She held up her other hand. Open and empty. No weapon. No threat. She met his eyes and held them, pouring every ounce of calm she possessed into the contact. His grip loosened, but he did not release her. "You are the healer from last night, the one who does not speak." She nodded. She withdrew the violet litmus strip from her apron and held it up. He did not know what it meant. She pressed the sealed letter into his free hand, watched his eyes move across her handwriting, watched the color leave his face line by line as the truth of what she had written settled over him like a shroud. Someone in his household was poisoning him. The poison was already in his blood, and without treatment, he would be dead within the month. "How long have you known?" he whispered. She held up one finger. "1 day. And you came alone, in the middle of the night, to tell me." His jaw worked. His hand, still wrapped around her wrist, trembled slightly. "What is your name?" She wrote 4 letters on a scrap of parchment and held it up. He read them. Something raw and stunned broke open behind his eyes, shuddered away almost immediately, but not before she saw it. Not before she felt the answering tremor of the pull rip through her chest like a fissure opening in dry earth. "Sable," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth sent a shudder through her entire body. He released her wrist. The absence of his touch felt like a wound. "Can you help me?" he asked. No command, no royal authority, just a man sitting on a cold floor in the middle of the night, asking a silent woman to save his life. She opened her kit and got to work, but her hands were shaking. And it was not from fear. Nightbloom extract could not be purged with a simple antidote. It had to be drawn out of the blood slowly, methodically, through bitter tonics and poultice wraps applied directly over the darkened veins. The process was agonizing, and it required sustained physical contact between healer and patient. She spent the first hour mixing charcoal root, ground fine, silver vein moss, dissolved in warmed spirits, 3 drops of distilled wormwood, no more, because 4 would stop his heart. He drank the tonic without complaint despite a bitterness that could make a grown man gag. He merely grimaced, set the cup down, and waited for whatever came next. The darkened veins were worse than she had feared when she unwrapped his sleeves. They threaded up from his wrists in a web of black and purple, branching beneath his skin like roots of a poisoned tree. She soaked strips of linen in the poultice and began wrapping from wrist to elbow, working methodically, hyper-aware of the tension in his muscles beneath her fingertips. "You have been in my household for 3 years, and I have never seen you," he said. Sable's hands stilled on the bandage. She did not look up. The words should not have stung. She had built her entire identity around being unseen. She had chosen it, cultivated it, wrapped herself in it like a cloak. But hearing him say it aloud, hearing the quiet shame in his voice, turned the choice into an accusation, less like armor and more like a grave she had dug for herself. "There is no excuse," he said quietly. "I should have known every person under my roof." She pulled a sheet from her apron and wrote, "You were 23 and had just ended a war. I was one face in a line of 12. I did not expect to be remembered." He read it. "That does not make it acceptable." She wrote again. "No, it does not." The honesty caught him off guard. He studied her with a look that might have been respect, grudging and new and uncertain, like a man encountering a species of animal he had not known existed. A pattern formed over the nights that followed. She arrived after midnight, mixed the tonic fresh, adjusted the poultice concentrations based on the changing color of his veins, and spent an hour in careful silence treating the king while he sat on the floor because he refused to be seen in a position of weakness anywhere a servant might chance upon him. He talked. She had not expected that. On the second night, he asked how she had identified the night bloom, and she wrote her explanation across 3 sheets that he read every word of, asking questions with the precision of a man accustomed to evaluating intelligence reports. On the third night, he asked about the apothecary, about Orenna, about the herbs she worked with most and why she preferred certain preparations over others. He listened to her written answers with a focus that she found almost unbearable, because no one had ever been that interested in what she had to say. Or, more accurately, what she had to write. On the 4th, he told her about the Black Fang Rebellion. Not the clean, strategic version the court knew, the real one. The mud and the fear and the young soldiers who did not come home, while he made decisions from a command tent that smelled like wet canvas and dread. He told her about Maren, a healer from the northern settlement who had tended the wounded during the siege. She had been killed by a stray mortar round on the last day of fighting, hours before the ceasefire. He said her name the way you say the name of a wound that never fully closed. Sable listened with her hands on his forearm, applying fresh poultice, and did not write a response. She simply looked at him when he finished, and whatever he saw in her expression made him exhale slowly, like releasing a breath held for years. "Most people fill silence with noise," he said. "You fill it with presence." She wrote, "You fill silence with wars. That is also different." He made a sound that was almost, not quite, a laugh, the ghost of one. The scaffolding where a laugh might eventually be built. She found herself looking forward to the walk through the darkened corridors, Found herself mixing the tonics faster so there would be more time for the conversations that happened while she worked. Found herself memorizing the way his voice dropped lower when he said something honest, as though truth required a different register than command. This was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. But knowing did not stop her from counting the hours until midnight. On the 5th night, the veins had begun to lighten. The poison was receding. She was tying off the final bandage when his hand closed over hers. Not a reflex. A deliberate, conscious choice. His fingers curled around hers, warm and rough and steady. "Thank you," he said, and the weight behind it was enormous. Not gratitude for the treatment, gratitude for showing up, for being there night after night and treating him like he was human rather than a crown with a body attached. She wanted to write something back. She wanted to tell him that she had not done it for duty or for obligation or because Torben had asked. She had done it because somewhere between the 2nd night and the 5th, the king had stopped being a symbol and had become a man, and the man was someone she could not walk away from. She slipped her hand free gently, packed her kit, and left. In the corridor, she pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. The creature inside her was keening, throwing itself against the cage of her ribs with a desperation that bordered on violence. He was the king. She was an invisible omega who communicated through scraps of paper. Whatever the connection wanted to tell her, it did not change the fundamental mathematics of who they were. But the mathematics were getting harder to believe. On the 7th night, Torben returned. He took in the scene. Sable kneeling on the stone, the king seated against the wall with bandaged forearms, the scattered written notes covering the table, and his expression went cold. "You trusted a mute kitchen servant with this instead of waiting for me?" Torben said. "She is an apothecary apprentice, not a kitchen servant," Caspian corrected, and there was an edge in his voice that had not been there before. "And she walked into my private quarters alone at 2 in the morning to tell me someone was trying to kill me. That requires either remarkable courage or remarkable stupidity, and her treatment suggests the former." Torben read through Sable's notes in silence. Page after page of observations, measurements, concentration calculations. When he finished, the coldness was gone, replaced by something she had not expected. Respect. "This is exceptional work," Torben said quietly, looking at her. "The concentration analysis alone is beyond what most trained healers could produce." Sable stared at her hands. "She cannot stay invisible," Torben told the king. "If the poisoner discovers she has been treating you, they will accelerate their timeline or vanish entirely. Either outcome is catastrophic. We need to legitimize her presence. Give her a reason to be near you that no one will question." "What are you suggesting?" Caspian asked. "Assign her as your personal physician." "She is an apprentice." "She is the only person who identified a poison that your entire medical staff missed for months," Torben said. "Apprentice or not, she is the most qualified healer in this castle right now." Caspian looked at Sable. "Would you accept?" The question stunned her. He was asking, not commanding, not issuing a royal decree, not even framing it as a suggestion disguised as an order, the way powerful men usually did when they wanted compliance without the discomfort of appearing forceful. He was looking at her with those dark gold eyes and genuinely, actually asking a tribute Omega whether she was willing to take on a role at the center of the most dangerous secret in the kingdom. She held his gaze and felt the weight of what he was offering settle over her. Not just a title, not just access and authority, a place beside him. A reason to stay in the upper levels, in the warmth, in the orbit of a man whose presence made every nerve in her body sing. She wrote carefully on fresh parchment. "I will accept on one condition. You stop sleeping on the floor. You have a bed. Use it." Torben made a sound that might have been a choked laugh. The king shot him a look that could have stripped paint from a wall. Overnight, Sable went from invisible to indispensable. She was given quarters adjacent to the king's chambers, a small room with a narrow bed and a window that overlooked the inner courtyard. The first night she spent there, she lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the upper levels, the guards changing shifts, the distant murmur of servants in the corridor. And through the wall, faint but unmistakable, the restless movement of a man who could not sleep. She pressed her hand against the stone and felt the cold seep into her palm, and something inside her ached with a tenderness she had no name for. Unrestricted access to the apothecary stores followed, a seal bearing the king's mark that would grant her passage through any door at any hour. Permission to requisition supplies without approval from the household steward, whoever would eventually replace Hadrian. And proximity. Constant, devastating proximity. The treatments moved from the king's study to his private sitting room. The shift brought a change in atmosphere that she had not anticipated. The study had been neutral ground, functional and impersonal. His sitting room was something else entirely. It was filled with books stacked on every surface, with worn leather chairs that held the imprint of his body, with the lingering warmth of his scent that set every instinct inside her pacing ceaselessly behind her ribs. Cedar. Iron. Something warm beneath, like sun-heated stone. She was losing the battle against the connection between them. It lived in the way her hands lingered on his skin during the poultice changes, in the way her breathing synced with his when the room went quiet, in the way she found herself leaning closer than necessary, inhaling deeper than necessary, cataloging every note of his presence like a scholar studying a text she had been forbidden to read. He noticed. His breathing changed when she was close. His hands clenched against the arms of his chair when her fingers traced the fading patterns of his veins. He stopped talking mid-sentence sometimes and simply looked at her, his gaze heavy and searching, until she forced herself to turn away. Neither of them acknowledged it. Neither of them had to. The air between them acknowledged it for them, charged and heavy and electric, until even the act of handing him a cup of tonic felt like an act of intimacy that left her skin humming for hours afterward. On the 10th night, the veins had cleared to a faint gray shadow. A few more treatments and they would be gone entirely. "What happens when the treatment is finished?" Caspian asked, his voice carefully flat in the way she had learned meant he was controlling something volatile. "You will have no medical reason to be here." The thought of being reassigned, moved back to the lower levels, returned to the invisible life she had built for herself away from him, produced a reaction so violent it startled her. Her vision darkened at the edges. Her hands began to shake. The creature inside her threw itself against the inside of her ribcage with a howl so desperate she nearly gasped aloud. She wrote, her handwriting unsteady. "We can discuss that when the time comes." She stood to leave. At the door, he said her name. "Sable." She stopped, did not turn. "I will find a reason for you to stay." She left before he could see the tears tracking down her face. That night, alone in her quarters, she pressed her palms against the ache in her chest and knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that when the treatment ended, she would not survive the distance. And she was not sure she wanted to. Torben found the poisoner on the 12th day. Hadrian Voss, the king's personal steward. 15 years of service since the old king's reign. A man so woven into the fabric of the household that suspecting him would have been like suspecting the walls. He had been the instrument of a faction among the border lords who wanted a weakened king, a puppet they could manipulate from the shadows while the throne's authority bled out drop by poisoned drop. Hadrian had disappeared during the night, and before leaving, he had accessed the king's private study, troop positions, garrison rotations, border defense schedules, everything a hostile force would need to launch an assault on the northern settlements. Worse, Torben believed Hadrian had introduced a secondary compound before fleeing, something faster, something designed to finish what the night bloom had started, now that the slow approach had been discovered. They found Caspian standing at the window of his sitting room, a confession letter in his hand. Hadrian had left it on his desk, a final act of cruelty disguised as honesty. The king's skin had taken on a grayish pallor that had not been there the previous night. His breathing was shallow. His hands, when he turned to face them, were trembling. Sable took his wrist without asking. Racing pulse, erratic, stumbling over itself like a heart that had forgotten the rhythm. She checked his eyes. Left pupil blown wide, right constricted to a pinpoint. Wolfsbane. The concentrated extract that attacked the bond between a shifter and their wolf, severing the connection strand by strand. In high enough doses, it killed the wolf entirely. And when the wolf died, the man followed. Her hands moved fast. She measured, mixed, heated, strained, driven by instinct and training, and the howling desperation of a wolf that could feel its counterpart dying in the man standing before her. Because she could sense it through the connection, his wolf weakening. Like watching a fire being smothered, the light dimming, the heat fading, the presence guttering toward nothing. She pressed the antidote into his hands. He looked at her face, at whatever he saw written there, and drank without question. Torben converted the sitting room into a treatment space within the hour. A cot was brought in. The fire was stoked. Guards posted at every entrance. And then the door closed. And it was just the two of them. The first 12 hours were brutal. His temperature spiked violently, then crashed, cycling between burning fever and bone-deep cold that left him shaking beneath every blanket she could find. She administered the antidote every 4 hours, adjusted dosages based on his pupil response, applied compresses to his wrists and throat. He was delirious for stretches, calling out to dead soldiers, to his father, to Maren. Between the doses, she sat beside him and held his hand, not because the treatment required it, because every time she let go, his breathing worsened, because every time her fingers left his skin, the fire inside him dimmed a fraction, and she would not, let it go out. The sitting room shrank to the size of their two bodies. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel marked hours that felt like weeks. She talked to him in written notes that he could not read, scrawling sentences on parchment and holding them up to the firelight as though the act of forming the words might somehow reach him through the fog of the wolfsbane. She told him about the herbs she loved, about the first time Orena had praised her work, about the garden she wanted to build if she ever had a room with a window that caught the southern light. Then, during a moment of terrible clarity in the deepest part of the night, he looked at her with eyes that were fully present and said, "I can feel him dying. My wolf. He is dying, and I cannot reach him." Sable took his hand, held it tight. Her wolf surged forward, not pacing now but blazing with something fiercer, something protective and savage that she had not known lived inside her. It pressed across the distance between them, reaching for his flickering wolf like a hand plunging into dark water to pull someone drowning to the surface. Caspian gasped. His body arched. A sound tore from his throat that was not human, not wolf, but something between. Then he collapsed, his head falling forward against her shoulder, trembling violently. But the fire inside him steadied. The flickering stopped. She held him, pressed her face into his hair, and let her wolf pour everything it had into the fragile thread connecting them. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were clearer. He looked at her for a long time, and she watched him decide something. "You are my mate," he said. Not a question. A statement delivered with the quiet devastation of a man who had known the truth for days and had been trying to pretend otherwise. "I have known since the moment you touched my wrist. I said nothing because you deserve better than a king with poisoned blood and a dying wolf, and a castle full of people trying to destroy him." Sable's vision blurred. She blinked hard, but the wetness spilled over anyway, tracking hot lines down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. "I cannot ask you to stay," he said. "Not for this. Not for me." She wrote one sentence on the parchment beside the cot, pressing so hard the pen nearly tore through the paper. "You do not get to decide what I deserve." The sound he made was not a laugh and not a sob. It was something in between, wrenched from a place so deep it seemed to surprise even him. She took his hand, laced her fingers through his, and did not let go. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was pressing against the windows. Inside, the fire that was his wolf burned a fraction brighter. And Sable held on, because letting go was no longer something she knew how to do. The crisis broke on the second day. His fever cleared by mid-morning, leaving him drenched in sweat and weak enough that he could not lift his own head from the pillow. Sable changed the damp linens, administered the antidote with hands that had stopped trembling only because she had forced them to, and monitored his pulse every 30 minutes until her own body began to rebel against the exhaustion. She had not slept in 36 hours. He noticed. "Sleep," he said, his voice rough but clearer than it had been since the wolfsbane hit. She wrote on the parchment beside his chair, "I need to monitor your pulse. Then sleep between the checks. The cot is right there." She stared at him. He stared back. There was a stubbornness in his expression that she recognized because she owned an identical version of it. "You cannot save me if you collapse," he said. "Rest." She wanted to argue. She wanted to write something sharp about kings who gave medical orders without medical training. But her body was betraying her. The exhaustion had seeped into her bones, turning her limbs heavy and her vision soft at the edges. She moved to the cot and lay down. "I am still here," Caspian said quietly, as though he could sense her reluctance through the thread connecting them. "I am not going anywhere." She slept. When she woke, the room was dark. The fire had burned low. The chair was empty. Panic hit her like ice water. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, scanning the room, her heart slamming against her ribs. He was standing at the window, not slumped, not bracing himself. Standing upright, shoulders squared, hands clasped behind his back. The posture of a king surveying his domain. Moonlight carved his profile in silver, and when he turned to look at her, his eyes were steady and burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. She crossed the room and took his wrist. Warm skin, not hot, strong pulse, regular and steady. Equal pupils, the darkening gone entirely. She checked the temperature at his throat, pressing the back of her hand against the skin just below his jaw, and he went very still beneath her touch. "Your wolf?" she mouthed. "Weak, but present. Because of you." Her eyes filled and the wetness came before she could stop it. His thumb caught it on her cheek. The tenderness of the gesture cracking open something she had been holding shut for years. "I need to tell you something," he whispered. "And I need you to hear it, even if you cannot respond." She looked up at him through wet lashes. "I did see you," he said. "In the line. I saw the bruise on your jaw, and I wanted to kill whoever had put it there. The feeling was so immediate and so violent that it frightened me. I was 23, barely holding this kingdom together, and a girl I had never met looked at me and something inside my chest broke open." Sable's lips parted. "I walked past you because I was terrified. Not of you, of what you made me feel. I had just spent a year watching people die because I gave orders, and I would not let myself want someone." He paused. "So I buried it. And then you disappeared into the household, and I told myself I had made the right choice." His voice broke on the last word. "And then you knelt beside me at 2 a.m. and pressed your fingers to my wrist, and every lie I had told myself fell apart in a single heartbeat." She took his hand from her face, held it between both of hers, pressed her lips to his knuckles. His breath shuddered out of him. He kissed her. Not gently, not carefully. Years of silence and distance and denial collapsing into a single point of contact. His hands found her waist and pulled her against him, and she went willingly, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, her body fitting against his with a rightness that defied argument. His wolf surged through the connection between them, not flickering now but blazing, feeding on the contact, on her proximity, on the current that flowed between them. Her own wolf rose to meet it, and the two presences twined together. "Stay," he said against her forehead. "Not as my physician. Stay because this is where you belong, and I have wasted too long pretending otherwise." She pulled him down and kissed him again. What followed was slow and overwhelming. Every touch a question, every pause an invitation to pull away, every whispered word a promise. She could not tell him with words what he meant to her, so she told him with the press of her forehead against his collarbone. With the way she traced the fading lines where the night bloom had darkened his veins, her fingers memorizing the map of his survival. With the way she held his face between her palms and looked at him until he stopped trying to hide. When the mating bite came, it was mutual. His mark at her throat at the same moment she pressed hers against his shoulder, and the bond snapped into place with a force that stole every thought from her mind. She felt him, not beside her, woven into the fabric of her being. His grief, his guilt, his ferocious love, his fear that he was not enough, all of it flooding through, and she poured herself back, her silence and her strength, and her stubborn refusal to let him face anything alone. Caspian slept, deep, genuine, unguarded sleep, the kind that had eluded him for years. Sable watched him in the moonlight and felt, for the first time in her life, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She closed her eyes and woke to screaming. The screaming was inside her head, a sensation so violent it tore through the connection between them like a blade through silk. Caspian was beside her, thrashing, rigid, his hands clawing at the sheets. A low, guttural sound poured from his throat, animal and agonized. Beneath the physical reality, the mating link was flooding with images, a battlefield at dawn, scorched earth, and above it all, a presence, cold and deliberate and ancient, feeding on the anguish like a parasite attached to a wound. The wolfsbane had not just attacked his wolf. It had cracked open something deeper, something sealed behind his wolf's defenses for years. Now those defenses were weakened, and it was pouring through. She grabbed his shoulders. His eyes flew open, but they were flat, distant, filled with a darkness that had no bottom. "Caspian." She mouthed his name, gripping his face. "Come back. Come back to me." He stared through her. She closed her eyes and did something she had never done before. She followed the bond inward. The darkness swallowed her. She was standing on a battlefield. Churned earth, fallen soldiers, a sky the color of a bruise. Caspian stood at the center, younger, wearing armor stained dark. Around him, in a vast and terrible circle, stood the dead. Hundreds of them. Soldiers in torn uniforms, civilians, wolves frozen mid-shift, caught between forms. Silent, watching, reflecting nothing. Before him stood a woman. Small, old, white hair tangled and wild. Her mouth moved constantly, shaping a poisonous murmur that thrummed through the ground. The witch, the source. Not a single curse thrown in battle, but a living thing rooted in his guilt, fed by his grief, growing stronger every day he refused to forgive himself. The wolfsbane had simply blown the door wide enough for Sable to finally see what had been eating him alive for years. "You carry the dead," the witch's voice rasped from everywhere at once. "A king who kills must carry his dead. Put them down, and you become the monster they believe you are." He was not fighting, not resisting. He was standing in the middle of his own destruction and accepting it like a sentence he believed he had earned. Sable walked forward. The dead turned to watch but did not block her path. She stopped in front of him, cupped his jaw, and tilted his head until his eyes met hers. They were full of tears. "I killed them," he whispered. "I gave the orders. Some of them begged. Some were children. How do I put that down?" She looked at this man who had carried an army of ghosts inside his chest because he believed he did not deserve to set them free. And she understood that no tonic could cure this. This was not a wound of the body. This was a wound of the soul, and it required a different kind of medicine. She took his hands, placed them against her chest, over her heart, and held them there. Then she opened her mouth. The sound that came out was not a word. Not yet. It was a breath that had been trapped for 3 years, 4 months and 11 days. rising through her throat like water breaking through a dam. It hurt. It burned. It felt like swallowing glass in reverse. And then it became her voice. "You are not a monster," Sable said. The words were raw and fractured and barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that terrible field, they rang like a bell. Caspian's eyes went wide. His hands pressed harder against her chest, feeling the vibration of her voice beneath his palms. The shock on his face was total. The expression of a man witnessing something he had been told was impossible. "You are a man who was given impossible choices," she continued, her voice strengthening with every syllable, shaking but growing louder. "And you chose the ones that saved the most lives, even though the cost was unbearable. That is not cruelty. That is the burden of leading, and you have carried it alone for too long." The witch's murmuring grew harsher, pressing against Sable's words like a countercurrent. The dead shifted restlessly. The ground trembled. "I was silent because I believed my voice did not matter, because a king walked past me without a nod, and I decided that meant I was nothing. I let one moment of pain define my entire existence." She squeezed his hands. "You are doing the same thing. But you are not only the man who gave those orders. You are the man who wept for the dead, who memorized their names, who refused to sleep because forgetting them felt like a betrayal." She forced the words through the tightness in her throat, through the years of silence, through the fear. "You honored them by remembering. Now honor them by living. Let them rest. Let yourself rest." The witch screamed, tearing metal that ripped through the air and drove Sable to her knees. The dead surged forward, the circle tightening. Caspian caught her. His arms wrapped around her, shielding her with his body. And she felt the exact instant when something shifted inside him through the bond. He let go. Not of her. Of them. Of the weight. The guilt. The punishment he had been inflicting on himself night after night. The dead went still. One by one, they turned away. Soldiers first, then civilians, then wolves. They dissolved into the bruised sky like smoke from extinguished flames, their weight lifting from the air. The witch was last. Her mouth closed. The murmuring stopped. She was gone. The field dissolved. The sky cleared. The ground warmed and became solid light, warm beneath her knees like sun-baked stone. She woke in his bed, in his arms, morning sun streaming through the windows. Real sun, warm and golden. Caspian was awake, looking at her with an expression so tender it stole her breath. "You spoke," he said, his voice rough with wonder. The words came easier now, still raw, still unfamiliar, but present. Real. Hers. "I did," Sable said. He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her cheeks, the corner of her mouth. Each kiss a punctuation mark in a sentence he was writing against her skin. "Say my name," he whispered. She smiled, the first real, full, unguarded smile she had worn in years. "Caspian," she said. He closed his eyes. A tear slipped down his face. And she held him, the way she had held him through the poison and the wolfsbane and the ghosts, and the sun poured through the windows, and for the first time in either of their lives, neither of them was carrying anything alone. Healing was not a single moment. It was 1,000 small ones, each requiring its own measure of courage. Caspian still woke sometimes in the dark, reaching for her, his breathing sharp with the remnants of dreams that had not fully released their hold. On those nights, Sable pressed herself against his chest and spoke to him. Small things, nothing profound, just the sound of a voice he had waited years to hear, filling the space where the silence used to live. Her voice came back in stages, some days strong, other days barely a whisper, and she fell back on written notes and the language of hands. Caspian learned that language too. He learned her signs, her shorthand, the particular tilt of her head that meant she was amused, and the one that meant she was about to write something that would make him laugh. He laughed more now. Not often, not loudly, but enough that the court noticed. The court noticed everything. A mute omega, a tribute from a border pack, bonded to the Alpha King. The whispers were relentless, sharp, and cruel. But Caspian stood beside her at every formal function, his hand at the small of her back. When a visiting lord made a comment about the king's choice of mate within earshot, Caspian turned to him and said very quietly, "She saved my life. What have you done lately?" The lord did not make another comment. Hadrian Voss was captured at the northern border 3 weeks after his flight. The trial was swift. The conspiring border lords were stripped of their holdings. Torben oversaw the restructuring of the household with the thoroughness of a man who would never allow such a breach again. Mistress Orenna returned from the eastern garrison and found her apprentice installed in the queen's chambers. She said nothing for a very long time. Then she handed Sable a new set of healer's tools, finer than anything in the apothecary, engraved with the valorous crest. "You have earned these," Orenna said simply. Months later, on a morning like any other, Sable woke to find Caspian already awake beside her, watching her with an expression she had come to know well. "You are staring," she said, her voice soft with sleep. "I am admiring," he corrected. She smiled and closed her eyes. His arm settled around her waist, drawing her closer. Outside, the sun rose over Ashenmoor Keep. Inside, the Alpha King slept peacefully beside his mate, her voice a quiet hum in the back of his mind, steady as a heartbeat, constant as breath. He had ignored her for 3 years. He would spend the rest of his life making sure she was never overlooked again. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you very soon for the next one.